hitting record right now, and I'll send you a recording of the video when it's all done. I know some of you are having connection issues, so you can watch it whenever, but I think it's nice to do it together, and you can ask questions, and we can sort of keep things a little bit normal as we go. Let's see. All right, so in the last video, we were talking about Kant's metaphysics and the way that his metaphysics informs his ethics, right? And I wanted to highlight a couple of things, primarily the way that Kant separates the realm of reason from the empirical or anthropological realm, and the idea that Kant is trying to eradicate any trace of the empirical, of the anthropological from reason, from morality, and is trying to drive at the purest form of rational moral law available. One second, I'm going to close this door. So the essential idea for Kant is, again, to identify a universal and absolute moral law that is going to be based in pure reason, completely uninfluenced by anything empirical or practical, anything anthropological. What are the pure laws of reason and the pure laws, thus, of morality? And I made a, first of all, I want to reiterate again that for Kant, the only thing that matters in ethical consideration is the motive of an act, right? Is what your intentions are. For Kant, every act occurs within the physical realm, within the realm of appearances, and therefore it is impossible to know if any action in itself is truly motivated by pure moral law and pure reason, because everything that occurs in the physical realm is within the chain of physical causes. That metaphysics is not essential. The only thing we can know for sure is whether or not we have a good will, if we have good intentions, if we intend to act according to the moral law. We can't know if the consequences of our actions will in fact be good. We can't even know if the action in itself is good. All we can know is whether we are motivated by the pure rational moral law. So the only thing to take into consideration for Kant is the motive. And we'll see a little bit more about why that's true today. The other thing I want to reiterate is the way in which Kant is fundamentally different from the other two main kinds of ethics that we've looked at so far, virtue ethics and utilitarianism. Right? We saw at the end of the last class where we were all together, we were discussing this sort of much more horrific version of the trolley problem, where I was asking, if you are in the basement under the floorboards and the Nazis are coming to look for you, right? We remember this scenario, hopefully. And the question being, do you kill a baby in order to save 9 lives? Is it ever justifiable to commit infanticide? Are there any circumstances and situations where such an act might be justifiable? And in both Aristotelian and utilitarian ethics, there are situations where that kind of act might be the just thing to do and might be the best way to achieve the principle of utility. And the question that I asked at the end of that class with respect to that scenario is, are there any acts that are just fundamentally wrong, that you should never in any circumstances commit? And Kant is the only philosopher that we've seen who is going to say unequivocally, yes, there are certain things that one should never do under any circumstances, right, which violate an absolute moral law. And the other thing I want to reiterate from the last lecture is how Kant diverges from both Aristotle and Mill on the question of happiness. Right, obviously for Aristotle, happiness is the goal of all ethics, happiness as flourishing, and the same is true for Mill, right? Ultimately, ethics is about pursuing pleasure and in more refined forms, pursuing high active pleasures. But nevertheless, the goal is happiness. For Kant, ethics is divorced from happiness. Ethics is not about happiness. And in fact, ethics is going to often run contrary to your happiness. Ethics is likely to make you unhappy. And following the absolute moral law is going to be very difficult and unpleasant. So I think that Kant's view of ethics is, aligns a little bit better with sort of the common sense way that we think about ethics now. We saw examples of this throughout the semester when we were discussing this, right? Ethics is generally about eschewing self-interest. It's about something more than self-interest and happiness and pleasure. And that idea of ethics comes from Kant, the idea that you have to do the right thing even when it is not in your interest. Right? Kant is the one who says ethics is often contrary to your interests, your personal interests. So I want to think a little bit more about why Kant thinks that happiness is not the goal of ethics. And let's read from page 6 here, why there can't be why the moral law is not about happiness. On page 6, he writes, "Now suppose that nature's real purpose for you, a being with reason and will, were that you should survive, thrive, and be happy. In that case, nature would have hit upon a very poor arrangement in appointing your reason to carry out this purpose." So let's start with just that. Now, suppose that nature's real purpose were that you survive, thrive, and be happy. If that is our goal, then why do we have reason? Reason, as Kant says, is a very poor tool for achieving survival, thriving, and happiness. In general, reason is something that often makes us unhappy, right? That even can torment us. Reason makes us second guess ourselves. Reason often tells us that what we want isn't good for us. Reason gets in the way of the things that we desire sometimes. So Kant's pointing out in the first place, reason very often seems to run contrary to our desires. So why do we think that our purpose as rational beings is simply to thrive and be happy? He goes on, "For all the actions that you need to perform in order to carry out this intention of nature, and indeed the entire regulation of your conduct, would be marked out for you much more exactly and reliably by instinct than it ever could be by reason." So if the goal of being human were merely to seek happiness, then we would be better guided by instinct alone. Right? Instinct is a better tool for pursuing happiness than reason is. So why do we have reason? If it's not about pursuing happiness, what function does it serve? The other ethical theories, utilitarianism and virtue ethics, treat us essentially like animals. We want to flourish, we want pleasure. And that's what other animals want also, right? They want to thrive. They want to achieve self-realization through right, growing to the proper age, reproducing, whatever it might be. And animals pursue pleasure also. So Kant is saying we are different from all those animals in that we have this higher capacity for reason. And therefore, reason seems as though it can't just be aimed at those same purposes, which instinct takes care of better than reason. So reason must be aimed at something else. What is it that reason is aimed at? Let's say that from the outset, well, let's read, sorry, one more quote here, jumping to page 22. Why reason is not a guide to happiness. We see on page 22, there couldn't be an imperative that in the strict sense commanded us to do what makes for happiness. Because happiness is an ideal not of reason, but of imagination, depending only on empirical grounds. This means that whether a person will achieve happiness depends on countlessly many particular facts about his future states. So, because happiness is unique to each person, and every person has a different idea about what happiness is, and because what makes a person happy will be different in different circumstances and at different times, reason cannot be the tool that leads to happiness. Reason is inherently, Kant thinks, about universal laws and about absolute immutable truths. It doesn't make sense that there could be a rational path to happiness because reason only applies to questions of universality. When we are wondering about how to be happy, when I ask myself, if I do X, will it make me happy? I'm not asking about reason. And that consideration is not one that requires reason. It requires instead the imagination. Do I imagine that doing X will produce Y consequence? There is, for Kant, no way to rationally be sure, have certainty that a certain act will produce happiness. I can only imagine that that act might produce happiness. So Kant is saying all of the things that I do in order to pursue happiness or pleasure are questions of the imagination. And they can't be about reason.